Good evening, everyone. My name is Michael Anderson, and I'm the president and CEO of the Oklahoma City Museum of Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture. Before I introduce our lecturer, let me just provide a few words of thanks for this exhibition's sponsors, Leslie and Clifford Hudson, the Oklahoma Humanities, Chuck and Renata Wiggin, Foundation Management, Inc., Mr. and Mrs. Duke Liggins, and the Honorable Jerome A. Holmes. So let's give them a round of applause. And let me also thank our two organizing institutions, American Federation of Arts and the National Academy of Design. So tonight's lecturer, Dr. Susan Rather, holds the Meredith and Cornelia Long Chair of Art and Art History at the University of Texas at Austin, where she chairs the Department of Art and Art History. During the early years of her career, Rather studied issues of modernism in early 20th century American and European sculpture, work that culminated in her 1993 book, Archaism, Modernism, and the Art of Pallmanship. Her most recent book, published by the Yale University Press in 2016, is The American School, Artists and Status in the Late Colonial and Early National Era. The volume received the Smithsonian's 2018 Charles C. Eldredge Prize for Outstanding Scholarship in American Art, the 2017 New England Society Book Award for Art, and was shortlisted for the 2017 William M.B. Berger Prize for British Art History. So it's a really extraordinary book. Please do check it out after the lecture. I know that you'll want to. Over the many years of research for that project, Rather won grant support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Tyson Scholars Program at Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, the Winterthur Museum, American Council of Learned Societies, Yale Center for British Art, and the Massachusetts Historical Society. Her publications include essays for edited volumes and exhibition catalogs, as well as articles and book reviews for a wide variety of journals in the fields of history, art history, and even theater history, among them American Art, Art Bulletin, 18th Century Studies, Journal of the Early Republic, Theater Notebook, William and Mary Quarterly, and the Winterthur Portfolio. So let's give Dr. Rather a very warm round of applause.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to move this aside. Nice to see you all. This is my first time not only in Oklahoma City, but also in Oklahoma. Believe it or not, I know, whoa. I live down the road in Austin. I don't claim to be a Texan, so we don't have any kind of problems there. I'm from Washington, D.C., but I have lived in Austin for a really long time. So it's really nice to be up here, and I was very happy to receive this lecture invitation because this is the last stop for this exhibition for America. And I was a contributing author to the catalog. I was going to see the show in Palm Beach for a lecture on March 16th, 2020. So you know what happened with that. It was canceled 4 days ahead of time, so that was really disappointing. So it's been traveling around. This is the last stop, and I'm thrilled to finally see the show, which I did today for the first time. So thank you very much for turning out. I'm going to be giving another talk tomorrow at 11 o'clock, and I want to start by sketching out how these two talks are different, just in case any of you are inclined to return in the morning. Both talks center on portraits of artists, of which there are about 50 in the exhibition upstairs. There are about 100 works in the show and 50 self-portraits. These are all drawn from the collections of the National Academy of Design in New York. This institution was founded in 1825. It's still going. And it has a whole lot of works because most of the National Academy's history, it required newly elected associate members to submit a portrait of themselves, not necessarily a self-portrait, because perhaps if you're a landscape painter, it's not something that you can do. And then once you were elected to membership, you submitted a characteristic example of your work. So the organizers of this exhibition knew, I think I totally forgot. I have slides. Oh, well, sorry, I'm going to change this, but here you have the title front and back covers of For America with this wonderful detail of a self-portrait by Andrew Wyeth. So the exhibition organizers knew that my scholarly work had focused on the representation of the earlier American artist. And when I say representation, what I mean is not only portraits and self-portraits, but also writings about artists in letters and diaries, newspapers that mention artists, and advertisements in newspapers. You'll hear a little bit about that today. In writings in magazines and books. Now, I'm talking really about the later 18th century and early 19th century. So there's very, very little such writing out there. For reasons I think will become clear in this talk. So often what I was trying to do was to discover what scraps of text there were and then try to figure out what I could make of this evidence, which was really fragmentary. Sometimes I'm talking about no more than a line of text. So to try to make something of that. So that's the kind of textual material I was dealing with in addition to the visual material. One of the things with writings like that is that you can't just, lift those things out of the context without understanding the context. So often I was asking questions about who is the writer, what is the gender, social position, politics, who were the intended readers, because of course every writer writes for particular audiences, and they take into account the reader's experience. So there's a whole lot of questions of that sort that go into understanding every single utterance on any kind of historical subject, obviously, not just the work of an art historian or my work, but any historian. And so my objective in this book, which I did work on for a ridiculous length of time, was a quarter century. It was a quarter century. So my objective was to piece together a more comprehensive picture than had previously existed, or just let's say the most comprehensive possible picture of what it meant to be an artist in the later 18th century and into the early 19th century. So my book was the culmination of all of that work, and that came out in 2016. So tomorrow, when I speak to the more general museum audience, I'm going to give more of an I don't give much of an overview at all tonight, but an overview of how Euro-American perspectives on artists changed beginning around 1500. And then I'm going to follow that. That's a fairly brief preamble. I'll focus on a pair of revealing early American comments about artists, so these texts that have interested me so much. And then I'll look at a couple of self-portraits by two of the most famous artists of that period, John Singleton Copley, of whom you have examples in this museum. I've looked at them today, Copley and Benjamin West. And then in the last part of that talk, I'll present the painting that I intend to focus on entirely with you. So, and that painting was also the subject of my essay in the catalog. So if you want to come back, I promise you'll learn some different things in the first half of that talk. So tomorrow I'll be looking at this self-portrait by John Singleton Copley, a pastel, Benjamin West's self-portrait, and I won't be talking about Stuart, but he was a key figure. These are all primary characters in my book. This is Benjamin West's drawing of Gilbert Stuart. This is the famous portraitist of George Washington, painting his portrait. Alrighty, so tonight I'm going to focus on the earliest work in the exhibition. This dates to 1809. It's a self-portrait by Samuel F.B. Morse when he was just 18 years old and a student at Yale College. 16 years later, when in his mid-30s, Morse became the founding president of the National Academy of Design. So this work obviously predates his time as president of the Academy, and therefore was not a piece that he presented to the Academy when he became an associate member. He just, went straight to, the finish line and became the first president. So the NAD is one of the oldest art organizations in the United States, and it was established with the mission of promoting the social value of art, the utility of art, the need for art, and the dignity of artists, and those things in a nation where art was considered suspect. Now, that would not have been a problem in Europe. In Europe, the cause for the dignity of art and artists had been launched in the 15th century in Italy. We all know about the Renaissance. By 1500 already, Michelangelo and his German contemporary Albrecht Dürer were credited with having godlike creative powers and special mental acuity that entitled them to be called geniuses. So, for example, when you look at Dürer's famous self-portrait, you cannot mistake the visual analogy of himself to Christ. And this painting really marks the beginning of the self-portrait tradition in Europe. There are some earlier examples, but this is when this tradition that you see represented, in self-portraits in the show upstairs, that's when this all really gets going. So this idea of the dignity of artists, starting in Europe in the Renaissance, spreads very quickly to France, Spain, and even to the Spanish New World. Yet even as late as 1750, in the English-speaking world, and here I'm including colonial British America and, of course, Britain, that those ideas had no traction at all. So my work in the book picks up around 1750 at a point when painters were still considered to be on par with other manual workers, including silversmiths, who would be kind of at the top of the heap of artisans, and shoemakers near the bottom. So artists around 1750 in the Anglophone world were considered hands, not minds. So that was an attitude behind that attitude really underlay an earlier New York-based organization, earlier than the National Academy. That was called the American Academy of Fine Arts. And that hardly included any artists at all in what was basically a club for gentlemen. So that was founded in 1802, and after 1817, the president of the American Academy was the aging painter John Trumbull. But Trumbull claimed superior rank, higher rank, the rank of a gentleman, not because he was an artist, but by virtue of his superior education. He went to Harvard, and he had also been a Revolutionary War officer at a time when officers were, by definition, gentlemen. In the U.S., where you don't have a landed gentry and aristocracy, perhaps we would argue about that, but not in the British sense. A gentleman was an educated professional man, so lawyers, doctors, and so on. Well, not much of the so on at start. Now, Trumbull, I said he was aged when he took over the American Academy. Trumbull was only 46 when he portrayed himself in this work. But I think you can look at it and see that he's really projecting this sense of gentlemanly superiority in this work. He does show himself with artist tools. But I want to make the distinction by comparing that to an English self-portrait by James Barrie of around the same time. James Barrie comes across, he's created a self-image in which he looks sort of like the disheveled, ungovernable genius. And that was a type that was already gaining currency in Britain in the later 18th and early 19th century, when that was less true. Now, you might think, well, he's a young upstart whippersnapper, and that's why he shows himself this way. Actually, James Barrie was 15 years older than Trumbull, so this had nothing to do with his actual age. It was a kind of image that he wished to project, and which clearly Trumbull was not going to have anything to do with. So let me give you a little bit more sense of Trumbull. I'm trying to set the stage for why the National Academy Design needed to be founded. A group of young artists reached out to John Trumbull as the American Academy president. They wanted permission to draw from plaster casts of ancient statuary that the American Academy owned. Now, this is from 1901. This is the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, which is in fact the oldest continually existing art institution in this country, older than the NAD. And you can see students here still in 1902 drawing from Cass. So these young artists approached Trumbull. They wanted to draw from the Cass, and Trumbull famously said, this is actually in a letter to a third party, he said, "The gentlemen," and here he means the members, "the gentlemen have gone to great pains to acquire the Cass, and the artists must remember that beggars are not to be choosers." Okay, so that was a senior American artist around 1820-ish, addressing younger artists and saying, sorry guys, you're riffraff. You can't come in and learn from this stuff. So the other thing I want to tell you about Trumbull's American Academy is that it largely ignored contemporary art at its annual exhibitions. The American Academy featured all sorts of pictures that its members, remember, the gentlemen, that they valued. So those would be copies after European old masters, portraits, and the American Academy also repeatedly showed the same paintings by the first American to have an international presence, and that was Benjamin West. West left the colonies in 1760. He never lived in the United States. He was a mentor to many American artists, but in what sense was he American? This is actually this is the subject of the final chapter of my book. West was in his 80s when he completed this painting, Death on a Pale Horse, in 1817. Now, this work, which you can see is huge, wasn't shown at the American Academy. It wasn't one of the works that was showed, but what they did was they would show the same paintings by West over and over again. This did become the star acquisition of an early Philadelphia museum, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, when that institution acquired it in 1836. They paid the then astronomical sum of $7,000, which was raised by mortgaging the museum building itself. So the thing about when people went to the American Academy exhibitions, they kind of joked about it, or maybe, younger artists and critics who were hungry for something different in American art. And so the joke was, have you seen the exhibition this year? Nah, I saw it last year. So the National Academy of Design, 1825, founded 1825, they set out, and I'll get to who they included. They set out to have an institution that was of, by, and for living artists. The NAD included an educational program, so none of this, Trumbull, go away, guys stuff. And at exhibition, the NAD featured young artists in their 20s and 30s, like Thomas Cole and William Sidney Mount, when they showed these two paintings with the National Academy. They and others, you can see this is not like the history painting of Trumbull. They're not portraits. These younger artists just around that time had started to really try to define a sort of distinctively American kind of painting, and to take American painting in an obviously nationalistic direction. And so the NAD supported all of that. So in addition to mounting annual shows, the National Academy also set out to build a permanent collection, again by requiring that newly elected academicians submit a characteristic sample of their work. So for Thomas Cole, that would be landscape painting, and for Mount, genre painting, a scene of everyday life. New associate members, again, were asked to submit a portrait of themselves. And so here, the Academy, the National Academy, so you can forget about the American Academy. I'm not going to be talking about that anymore. The Academy, the National Academy, has about 2,200 self-portraits in the collection, or 2,000 works overall in the collection, of which roughly 100 are on view in the exhibition. So among the NAD's self-portraits, you see here the earliest, which is Samuel F.B. Morse's self-portrait that I showed you before, and Peter Saul's self-portrait of 2013. Of course, both of these are in the exhibition upstairs. Morse, let's go on to him. By age 50, despite his leadership of the Academy, so I'm fast forwarding to the early 1840s, Morse was really discouraged with the career that he'd had as a painter. In fact, he gave up painting in the early 1840s and then returned to the scientific endeavors of his, or scientific studies of his college years. So you know this guy, right? This is the Morse who was among the inventors of the telegraph and the person who devised, thank you. See, you don't need me, Morse code. So Morse the artist, so in my book, I didn't really have much to say about Morse. He figures in the last chapter or the conclusion to my book. So when the curators, Diana Thompson, one of them is here this evening, when the curators reached out to me asking me to submit an essay for the catalog, they particularly wanted me to write about Morse's little self-portrait. So I was really happy to have that opportunity to look at Morse really on the verge of becoming. I will say that if I knew what I discovered in doing the research for that essay, it would absolutely have been in my book. But I hadn't done that. I could certainly have worked it in. And I'll also tell you that when I was asked to write about it, so when you go up in the show, maybe you've done that. I mean, it's a little painting. And it looks bigger because of the way it's framed, but it's a miniature. And I think I have the dimensions on a slide coming up. You know, it's about yay big. And, well, you'll get a sense from what I have to say about it why it's been somewhat overlooked. And I thought, what am I going to say about that, Diana? What am I going to say about that? Well, okay, I know a lot about portraits and self-portraits. I'm sure I can find something, and I didn't really have a very long essay to write. And I just ended up, it kind of blew my mind that the things I found and that I figured out. So it was a really exciting time that I was writing on it. It wasn't 25 years. It was only a couple of months. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So we know from family correspondence that Morse began drawing by age 11. So we might think of this as a really common pursuit for children. We encourage children to be artistic. That was not the case at the time, when drawing was a luxury reserved for the well-off. So Morse's father was a prominent minister and geographer, and it made some sense that he would have had the leisure of come from a family in which that might have been encouraged. Still, when Morse went off to Yale College at age 15, he was expected to prepare for a profession. Art was not among the possible paths colleges or universities offered. And even in the early 19th century, painters were still considered manual workers, or in 18th century parlance, artisans or tradesmen. After graduating from Yale, and we will go back to that time in a moment, but after graduating from Yale in 1810, Morse did openly commit to art. So he then went to Boston and embarked on a period of study with the European-trained American artist Washington Allston. Allston, this was a kind of a good model, really, especially in persuading Morse's parents, because Allston was from a wealthy South Carolina family. Allston went to Harvard, which, not the kind of thing an artist would usually do. And he was also committed to what was then known as history painting. And I was delighted to see in the galleries that the paintings have been organized in a series of galleries, not in this exhibition, in the permanent collection, by genres, right? So this hierarchy of the genres with history painting at the top and their portraits, landscapes, still lifes. I'll talk more about the hierarchy of the genres tomorrow, but I was delighted to see that you'd be a knowledgeable audience and wouldn't require a lot of explanation about that. So history painting, pinnacle, right? Highest thing you could do, intellectual, teaches a moral lesson, etc. This is a history. It's obviously largely a landscape, but it's a history painting insofar as there is a mythological subject which elevates the mere landscape. So This is the point at which scholars know Morse. You know, he goes to study with Alston, he's embarking on this career, then he goes off to London. How Morse learned to paint before that time, before his time with Alston, had not particularly concerned writers. Most considered Morse to be self-taught. One described the self-portrait that I'll be talking a lot more about in a moment as the immature wanderings of a dabbler. The guy who wrote that is a friend of mine, but I sort of thought, really? And that was kind of what sparked me when I started to work on this painting. Obviously, I wanted to read everything anybody had written about it, which was not much. And we'll get back to that painting. So what I found in looking at the scholarship is that Morse's juvenilia, and here you have a couple of examples, seem to be completely irrelevant to his later professional career, and the later professional career was the only part that mattered. So therefore, we don't need to talk about any of the early works. This rush to judgment actually arose from prejudice that were rooted in Morse's time. So several things I want to point out. His early works, including these, at least up to a point, are watercolors. Watercolor painting was a medium favored by amateurs because it was less complicated, less messy, and less space-consuming than the old master medium of oil. So it was suitable for doing in the drawing room, you know, by a young woman, for example, or I would say the dorm room in Morse's case at Yale College. So watercolor, which miniatures were tainted as a medium favored by amateurs. The second point to make is that Morse's early works were portraits. And the one on the right is actually drawn and then colored, so not a watercolor, maybe in the sense a work that's not first drawn would be. So portraits had a bad rap in the hierarchy of the genres. The other thing is most of these early portraits were also watercolors. So you've got kind of a double whammy there. The thing about, and then the third thing is that they're miniatures. Miniatures were the most deeply private type of portraits. They were totally cut off from the civic-minded discourses of history painting, that Morse would encounter once he went to Alston's studio in 1810, or certainly after he went to London. In fact, the academic contempt for miniature portraits was, well, it comes through loud and clear in a remark by a top artist in London around the time that Morse was starting out his career, and where Morse traveled in 1811. This artist said that miniature painting, and I'm quoting, will always be the refuge of imbecility, a receptacle for the poor and disappointed in art. So a lot of contempt heaped on miniature painting, on portraits, and on watercolors. So we can imagine that Morse, after he embarked on this professional career, might have been really embarrassed about where he started out. And honestly, I think that art historians dismissing his early work were still buying the academic discourse, the academic line, and just not really paying attention for the reasons that Morse's contemporaries didn't pay attention to such works. In 1809, though, when he made this work, Morse was pleased with himself, having found encouragement from Yale students and professors. So we know that he wrote a self-congratulatory letter around the same time. He was writing to his parents, and he's, of course, pleased with himself. So he says, "My price is $5 for a miniature on ivory, and I've engaged 3 or 4 at that price. My price for profiles is $1, and everybody is willing to engage me at that price." So what really is notable here is his rather tradesman-like focus on money. Gentlemen do not talk about money. So that must have really alarmed the Morse parents when they got this letter. I mean, how many times does he say dollars in that sentence? And just as a point of comparison with Morse's $5, because I was thinking, well, what is that $5? I did find out that a well-established American miniaturist who had studied in London recorded a payment around this in 1802 of $50 for a miniature. So I'm sure it ran the gamut, but $5 I think would have been pretty inexpensive, and that makes sense. So in his self-portrait, which is roughly 3¼ by 3¼ by 2½ inches, Morse appears relaxed and confident as he gazes directly out at the viewer, though of course we understand that in the process of making the work, the artist's eye met his own mirrored reflection. He has smooth skin, wide open eyes, arched brows, and upwardly curved lips that convey a friendly inquisitiveness. The artist's light touch of watercolor brush to ivory when painting his skin yielded a material transparency that seems, in a way, to project qualities of the subject himself. Now, you'll have noticed right away that Morse holds tools that identify him as an artist. He's got a palette secured by the left thumb and fingers, and a brush poised in the somewhat boneless hand of his strongly foreshortened right arm. Like most self-portraitists, Morse corrected the mirror's reversal. Of course, when you look at yourself in a mirror, it's reversed. He has corrected it. That was very typical for self-portraits, so that when we look at it, we read the right hand correctly. That was true to his own physiological right-handedness. What's interesting here, and I'm not the first to have noticed this, is that Morse chose not to represent the work we see. And the tools are the giveaway. Morse has an evidently wood-grained palette dotted with discrete spots of color, which indicate pigments mixed with oil, which then have enough substance to adhere on the palette where the artist has placed them, even if he tips the palette. Miniaturists, by contrast, typically worked in watercolor, as Morse did in making his self-image despite its misdirection, and the misdirection that it shows him holding oil painter's tools. So miniaturist tools included tiny and non-absorptive ivory or porcelain palettes, so not a big old wood palette. Imagine if you put water on that. What's it going to do? Ivory or porcelain palettes. Miniaturists use powdered pigments molded into cakes. We're all familiar with those. Water, obviously, and gum for binding colors and glazings. So what you're looking at in these slides, on the left, you see this very tidy toolbox of a miniature painting, which I photographed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I just love this. So you could, carry this thing around. But you could also imagine somebody painting in the drawing room, right? A young woman painting. So there you see all the things in the toolbox. The slide on the right is the image on the right is by Charles Wilson Peale, a leading portraitist of the later 18th century, and he's included a box like it in this portrait of his brother James Peale making a portrait. So again, you can see James Peale there sitting before the small toolbox, which is sitting on a table. The top of the toolbox, as you can see there, pops up as an easel. Now, notice that the miniatures in the example at the Met and the one that James Peale worked at are oval-shaped. Oval miniatures dominated at the time that Morse made his own rectangular-shaped likeness, and that's because the smooth contours of the oval made them suitable for wearing on the body, which was the custom with intimate portraits that were usually bestowed as gifts, right? So you could wear it on your wrist, you could, wear it in other ways. Morse's rectangular format self-portrait is a little bit unusual in that regard, but I think it better suited his purpose. And, I would say that this Yale self-portrait served at once to display Morse's skills to those professors and students who might pay him $5 for a portrait, but also to represent his aspirations, if not his immediate capacity to paint in oils on canvas. He wasn't doing it then, but this is where he wanted to go. So I really did wonder, though, how Morse acquired the skills to paint this, because this really does not, I can't, I'm not going to dig that quote back out again, but this kind of, idea that this is sort of hack work or, the immature daubing of whatever my colleague said. It just didn't strike me that way. So, I really wondered how Morse had learned to paint. I know that self-taught artists can learn by visual example, and that was the claim, that he was self-taught. So the Morse family home contained family portraits in oil and miniature. This is the recto and verso of a miniature of Morse's own father, Jedediah. And so, obviously, the portrait. And then on the reverse, you have this little image showing the senior Morse, the geographer, instructing a group of young women. And this is all on a surface that is no bigger than the size of my thumb, right there. So that little scene is on a surface the size of my thumb. So Morse's miniature at roughly 3 by 2 is a fairly good-sized miniature. And again, rectangular. You wouldn't wear it. This certainly could be worn. So what I'm saying is, I knew that the Morse family home had portraits. He could have looked at those, but looking at a painting and making one is not the same thing. We also know that artists in 18th and early 19th century America could to some extent, teach themselves by using how-to books. I mean, British artists would do this too. How-to books, which were composed primarily for persons in the trade of art. So this is one of the most popular of the entire period, called The Handmaid to the Arts. But when I've looked at this book many times in the context of my research, there's almost no guidance for miniature painting, about miniature painting in this at all. I was kind of shocked to be reminded of that. There's nothing in here. So, I dug around, I looked at books that might have been available. We would have no evidence where they were available to Morse, and I didn't really see anything that made sense to me. I thought what was promising was there was a book focused solely on how to paint miniatures. This was first published in France in 1676. It was last issued in English in 1752, but I know that book has not been widely documented in this country, which doesn't mean it wasn't somewhere, but it also doesn't contain any instructions for painting on ivory, because in the French 17th century context, that was not the support for miniatures. So it didn't seem likely that even if Morse had access to that book, that he could have learned from that. So I still wondered, how did he learn to do this? And again, the skill evident in the self-portrait made me question whether he could have been self-taught. So one of the things I knew from my research was that painters at the time, behaving like the tradesmen they were, sometimes advertised their services in newspapers. And so I decided to dig around in New Haven newspapers of that period to see what I could find. And it's just, fantastic that all these things are digitized and I could just, do that from my own desk. It did not take long. Bingo. I found the following notice in the Connecticut Journal for New Haven for May 14th, 1807, the notice at the top, and I'll read it. Dancing, drawing, etc. Mr. Thomas Gimbreed has the honor to inform the ladies and gentlemen of this city that he intends to spend the summer in New Haven and to teach the following branches of polite education: drawing, dancing, fencing, and the taking of miniature likenesses or profiles. Specimens of his painting may be seen at the bookstore of Beers and Howe. Nota bene, he will give private lessons in any of the above branches. So Morse is at Yale at the time I see this advertisement. Then a week later, Gimbreed announces that his lessons would occur in space rented with a Monsieur Value, whom he presents, this is a text at the bottom, as a professional partner. So now here's Value in his ad in a different local newspaper. Value had come to New Haven in 1806. He was teaching French, dancing, drawing, and music. And these were extracurricular pursuits, all of these, French, dancing, drawing, music, extracurricular pursuits that were of social value to the young men of Yale College. And in fact, in appeal to them. And let's see, it's not, oh, wait a minute. Oh, yeah, okay, there's values add. So you can see the names of Reverend Dr. Dwight and Mr. Silliman. Dr. Dwight was the president of Yale College, and Benjamin Silliman was a professor of science, and these were among Morse's teachers. So he's basically citing the endorsement of two, VIPs at Yale, one professor and one VIP, and saying, here are my services. So this was the key, because I was looking at reading Morse's letters in this period, and I found a letter, and these letters were known, but this is, you just have to put the pieces together. So on June 7th, 1807, that's when these ads are, Morse wrote to his parents, and he told them that he had thrown himself into the study of French. And he said, I am working on my French 24 hours a day, punctuated by, so he studies, and then he goes off and he says he gives a recitation to Monsieur Value. So I also know from the letters that the teacher, Monsieur Value, told his pupil that he'd soon be able to read any French book, and so Morse optimistically purchased examples at Beers and Howe, the print sellers that his father had authorized to supply Samuel's needs. And let me remind you that that is where Gimbreed, I think, yes, says people who want to learn from him can see his work. So within a single month, Morse had several paths to an encounter with Gimbreed. He may have noticed the art instructor's advertisements in a local paper. He probably saw examples of the miniaturist's work in the bookstore that he frequented. That's where his father had an account for him. And he must have actually had encounters with and learned about Gimbreed while attending French lessons with Monsieur Value. And, he was so intent on acquiring French. 24 hours a day he was studying. So I can only make a circumstantial case for Gimbreed as Morse's first teacher, but I'll tell you that having 3 ways to do it is very reassuring. I mean, I feel completely confident in saying that we have discovered the first art teacher of the noted painter Samuel F.B. Morse. So that was one of the discoveries I made in my work that was exciting to me. Let me tell you a little bit about Gimbreed before I move on to the other. Gimbreed began and this is an example of his work. There's very little work known by Gimbreed. He began his American life in Albany, where he advertised as an art teacher in 1802. From Albany, he went to New Haven, and then he rounded out the decade teaching art. Actually, he opened a drawing academy in Newport, Rhode Island. So Gimbreed was obviously quite committed to teaching in those years, and that might in part explain why his surviving body of work is so tiny. I mean, really, when I started looking around, I could only find 3 works. Those works include this really striking miniature of a man with strabismus, or misaligned eyes. And this work we can associate with Gimbreed because it's actually marked with his name along the rim at the left, and that's really impossible to see, but he's actually signed it. Another work identified with Gimbreed has a backing card in it. So if you imagine a miniature, the little ivory, and I actually will show a slide of a disassembled miniature in the talk tomorrow, but the little ivory disc, and then you've got the glass case with a kind of a jewelry case, essentially. You need to secure the miniature. So often studio detritus, sometimes playing cards, were inserted into the backing. So the backing card in this portrait has a text that says it was painted, so the Latin, right? Paints it by Gimbreed. So there's a couple of examples of his work. Now this one is not a black and white image. In this work, Gimbreed used gray-toned paint called grisaille, which is a French taste that he would have been exposed to in Paris. He studied art in Paris with a leading miniaturist before he emigrated in 1802. Miniatures, we know, were incredibly popular in France, as they were elsewhere, and they were generously represented in exhibitions of the French Academy. So Gimbride is offering to teach miniature painting, and I'm convinced did so, to Samuel F.B. Morse as a young student in New Haven. We know that in addition to offering miniature painting lessons, he also offered New Haven residents instructions in profile making. So profile making, what does this mean? Profiles were extremely popular in this period. In fact, it's well, very, very popular, yes. And the most popular type would be machine cut profile portraits. So that's what you're looking at on the upper left. There were machines designed to execute this. So you didn't have to have any special training to execute a profile. This is not a freehand thing, although they generally had finishing touches. Machine cuts were really, profiles were really popular. So here's this ad in the same column, by the way, with Gimbride's. I mean, you can find lots like this. So here's a profile, taker of profile likeness, R. Letton, who's respectfully informing the ladies and gentlemen of New Haven, so on and so forth. But notice that he says he takes the profile on beautiful wove paper with 3 minutes sitting. So you could make a profile really, really quickly. That also meant they were really, really cheap, and that meant that they were really popular. So lots and lots of profile silhouettes. I don't think that that's what Gimbride was offering. And I don't have any examples of what he did, but we can look at Morse's early work when he was at Yale College. And what you have here are hand-drawn profile portraits that have been accentuated with watercolor. And so I think this is Morse doing the kind of thing that Gimbride probably taught him to do. What's really interesting about these works is that Morse signed them with the term Pinxit, indicating that he painted them, the same term that we saw in the backing card. So, in other words, he's not really painting. He's drawing, and he's putting some watercolor, but he signs it with painting. So this ambition to be a painter. Gimbride was not in New Haven for very long. He left in late 1807. That was just 6 months after he first advertised there, but that was long enough to provide Morse, whom we know was highly motivated to practice anything he loved, with sufficient skill to attract customers for portraits. So by August 1809, the same year of the self-portrait, Morse reported happily to his parents again, probably not very smart, but he said, "I employ all my leisure time in painting. I have a great number of persons engaged already to be drawn on ivory, no less than 7. All right, so this is the early Morse, the overlooked Morse. He left all of this behind and committed fully to oil painting. This is not Morse. Committed fully to oil painting when he began to study with Washington Allston in Boston. So I mentioned Allston earlier. I showed you that historiated landscape with Diana and her nymphs in the chase. So he goes off to Boston. He's studying with this Harvard-educated, well-born, European trained painter who makes history paintings. And, you know, that is going to launch Morse on this sort of high-minded professional career. So this work on the upper left, I cannot blow that up bigger because it's a really small digital file, so that's as big as I could get it. I think we don't really want to see it any bigger. This is Morse's earliest large-scale multi-figure history painting, and it's big by comparison to his miniatures. It is a black and white slide. Landing of the Pilgrims at Plymouth. So Morse right away, as soon as he's with Allston, is starting to make works like this. Allston, at just that time or shortly afterwards, made arguably his masterwork. I love to say this title fast. No, Dead Man Restored to Life by Touching the Bones of the Prophet Elisha. So there you go. 1811 to 14, and it's a really big work, right? 13 by 10. So this is the impressive kind of dignified history painting career that Morse aspired to. So Alston goes off to London in 1811, and young Morse goes with him. Once he was in London, Morse gained admission to the Royal Academy of Arts, which was founded in 1768. He also benefited from 4 years of study and mentoring from Benjamin West, the American-born painter who became the Royal Academy's second president. So it would not have been news to Morse when he arrived in London that oil painting had high status in the Royal Academy's annual exhibitions. But the debased position of miniature painting might have surprised him, given how popular miniatures were in America and also had been in France, where Gimbride came from. I just wanted to show you, this is actually not in the show. I thought this might be hanging. This is Morse's portrait from that time of his London mentor, American-born painter Benjamin West, which is based on it's copied after this larger portrait by Sir Thomas Lawrence. So here, this is a famous etching showing the exhibition of the Royal Academy in 1787, and I've put a yellow box around that detail. This is colored. This is from a different version of the print, so it doesn't have the color in it. And what I wanted you to sort of see was all the little tiny circles there on the wall. Those are miniatures which are arrayed around the fireplace in the great room at the Academy. So that's an auspicious place to show them in this main, the great room. That was 1787. Soon after that, they were relegated to poorly lit ground floor spaces along with watercolors on paper, typically landscape. So, let's get them out of here. This stuff is not really important. Now, watercolor did surge in popularity in Britain around 1800 and after, and there were new organizations that sprang up to support watercolor artists, but even those organizations did not allow portrait painters and miniature painters in. So this was watercolorists of landscape. So it's really easy to imagine that surrounded by all of this and with Alston and West and hearing those, snide comments about portrait painters, like miniature painters, that West would have adopted the superior attitude of the oil painter that he wanted to be, the academic oil painter. And he could not have more conspicuously declared himself as an artist of a large-scale historical subject, like his teachers, his acknowledged teachers, Alston and West, than with the Dying Hercules on the left there, which won critical accolades at the Royal Academy's 1813 exhibition. On the right is a contemporaneous self-portrait, this time in oils. Morse here appears to be poised, I would say perhaps inadvertently, between the present and the recent past. And what I mean by that is that this painting has a relatively small format, 11 by 14 inches, so that somewhat recalls Morse's earlier miniature practice. On the other hand, you can see that Morse shows himself in academic robes, which distinguish him as a man with the education considered necessary for those who wanted to paint history. Now, Morse had a real college education, which was way beyond the level of schooling attained by most other painters during that period. But here's Sir Joshua Reynolds on the left, the British Royal Academy's first president. He was himself primarily a portraitist, which is a little bit of a problem because he was the figurehead of the first British Academy, but he was a portraitist. Reynolds had received an honorary doctorate of laws from Cambridge, and so beginning in 1763, he painted a series of self-portraits in which he, of course, shows himself in his doctoral regalia, including this one that Morse probably saw in a big exhibition of Reynolds' work held, Reynolds had died years before, held in London in 1813. And that event really solidified Reynolds' reputation as the founder of modern British painting. I mention that because at the same time, with Reynolds really saying, this is the father of British painting, that was really an accolade that Benjamin West felt he should have, the American Benjamin West, about whom there was a lot of sneering at that time. So West had lived in London since 1763. He identified with London. He considered himself a British artist. And what happens is right around the time of this 1813 retrospective of Reynolds, West begins to recast his lot with his native country. And he did that most famously in a famously mythicized biography of 1816, a collaboration with a Scottish writer, which was among the very first monographic biographies of any artist. And in that biography, West was presented as the founding father of American art, grounded in this previously unknown story of his Pennsylvania youth. I mention this because that book also, for the first time, disclosed the existence of a first art teacher that no one knew that West had had. And I write about that artist in the second chapter of my book. So let's go back to Morse here. Morse studies in London. He obviously is ambitious to be a history painter. He goes back to the United States and he's painting portraits. Portraits in oil, this is kind of disappointing. But by the middle of the 1820s, he really begins to build his artistic legacy. And he's only 36 in 1825 when he becomes the first president of the Academy. So that's the first thing. He becomes a president of the Academy. And then in 1831, he began his work on his self-intended masterpiece, Gallery of the Louvre. So this painting, this is really a big painting, and Morse studied it with, he began it, I should say, during a sojourn in Paris in the early 1830s, and he studied this painting with miniature versions of celebrated paintings from all over Europe, which he's imaginatively reunited in the majestic Salon Carré of the French National Gallery. This is a vast room where normally the exhibitions of French modern painting, the Salon exhibitions, took place. So Morse has basically put in the gallery that he would say these are the greatest works in the world, and he offered this painting to Americans as in effect a course of study in the old masters, not necessarily meaning that you would look at any of these miniaturized versions, and I'm sure you can recognize some of these works, and actually learn how to paint from it, but this is the exemplum, right? This is the kind of stuff that we Americans should be looking to. So he started the work in Paris after he returned to New York in 1832. The painting was unfinished, and then he spent 6 months completing the complex composition, populating it with associates and friends. So pretty much all the people shown in this work can be identified. So I'm not going to dig into this painting a lot. I just want to say that, but it leads to my key second discovery, which was really even more exciting than the first one. So this painting has been the subject of extensive scholarly inquiry over nearly 4 decades, and that peaked in 2014 with an exhibition and catalog called Samuel F.B. Morse's Gallery of the Louvre and the Art of Invention. I'll just go back to the whole work for a moment. So this was a scholarly catalog. There were essays by a dozen scholars, all writing about this. And so, one might wonder, I would wonder, what else could there possibly be to say about this work? And you may be asking, what the heck does this have to do with Morse's early self-portrait, the work with which I began? So I'm going to end this talk by calling attention to something about this painting. So you have all these women artists in this space, which is striking. On the left-hand side, that is Susan Cooper, the daughter of James Fenimore Cooper, who is with her and his wife. So she's working at an easel. We can't see the picture. It's so foreshortened as to be reduced to just an edge. She's turned away from the painting and talking to her her parents. The second woman in Gallery of the Louvre appears front and center in the large canvas, so you see her here. She is also momentarily distracted in her making, though productively distracted for sure, because she is receiving advice on her drawing from an instructor who leans over her shoulder. It is, of course, Samuel F.B. Morse himself, front and center in his painting, and possibly adapted from the 1812 self-portrait. So nobody would have had to guess at this. When Samuel F.B. Morse sent this painting on tour in the U.S., there was a key that told you what all the paintings were in the painting and who was in there. So he was well known, and he was the leader of the nation's most determined and nationalistic art institution, and ergo, the nation's art teacher. But let's look at the third woman, who is arguably the most focused on in the painting. There is a light. She is more brightly illuminated than any of the other figures in the painting. She sits at a stand that unambiguously represents her or identifies her as a miniaturist. Her presence has always been a bit of a conundrum to scholars because she's emphatically in a public space, right? Remember that miniature painting was identified with private domestic spaces. It was identified with amateur artists, which she certainly might be. She is a woman. She works in this space, though, without a human subject nearby. What is she painting? Why is she in there? She's in this space with these masterworks by Italian Renaissance artists and great Flemish masters. What is she doing in this? Unlike the other women artists whom I briefly identified to you, she is on her own. She's not being instructed or talking to anybody. She is independent. She is absorbed, thoughtful, and present. So I would say that it doesn't seem a stretch to see her as a figure for Morse himself. Morse at his artistic beginnings, when he too painted miniatures. Or even Morse in the presence of his magnum opus, which after all is covered with miniaturized versions of other artists' work. But it gets more interesting. Just beyond the miniaturist, Morse placed one of the most famous statues in the Louvre. This is the Greco-Roman figure of Diana the Huntress, striding across her plinth. The plinth, of course, is the sculpture's base. She is conspicuously white in this really hothouse, intensely colored environment of the Salon Carré. And behind her, we see an expanse of glowing red in a gold frame that further sets the statue off, or I would say, is Diana there to call our attention to it? So a closer look reveals a neat arrangement of miniatures in their own tiny and individuated frames. And this is a way that miniatures could be presented. In all of the writing on Samuel F.B. Morse's Gallery of the Louvre, the miniatures have received no comment, not one comment. I just could not believe it. I could not believe it. And I hope you understand that what I'm registering is delight, not superiority over any other scholars. I just couldn't believe it. And I could not believe that my work on that little miniature led me to this. So why have they been ignored? Is it because we can't imagine Morse granting miniatures any didactic value? In other words, did someone notice them and think, well, what could you say about that? Or did they maybe not notice them? I mean, I didn't ever notice them before, but I hadn't written about this work either. Morse invented this work, right? This painting is an invention. It is a creation. So it's not a depiction of the space as it appeared. So he put them there. And we have to ask why. So I would say on the evidence, miniatures still held meaning for Morse, even at this august moment in his career, if only in a way that remained largely private to him. So one scholar said, there are no imaginary works in Morse's Louvre. We can absolutely say that the miniatures are imaginary or must be imagined by the viewer, since of course they are illegible. We do not have the possible of identifying what masterworks these are that we should emulate. The other thing is that they don't make sense from the constructed viewing position. You need to get close to a miniature. Let's step back out here. There's no way that if you are in the gallery, you can see these works. They hang too high on the wall to be inspected by a visitor to the gallery, and in any case, the sculpture is in the way. So they are not there. We can't even understand them in a realistic way. You know, Morse has recreated this space, but we can't imagine seeing them. So we have to conclude that the presence of the miniatures in this painting is purely symbolic. Miniatures connect people in intimate ways, as private gifts among families, lovers, and friends. When Morse, around 1820, re-encountered a Yale student who had commissioned a miniature from him that the artist never finished and therefore never handed over, he told his former classmate, "I've carried it with me ever since and over Europe and thought 100 times that I would wash it out and put the ivory to some other use. This memorial of our former intimacy is still in my possession." This is a remarkable statement because it suggests that this token, that it was not maybe so much about his friend, that this token was a relic, not something he could erase by washing it out, that it represented really his own life, his own early life, his beginnings. So I would say that in the Gallery of the Louvre, the artist's deeply self-referential Gallery of the Louvre, the frame miniature portraits bear witness to his youthful artistic beginnings. Morse had proximate reason to reflect on his early experience with art as he prepared to complete this masterpiece of his maturity. During the last week of December 1832, when he was finishing this work, his first teacher, Thomas Gimbreed, died suddenly at West Point, where he had been a professor of drawing since 1819. He was just 51. Morse's young wife died a few years earlier, and we know from his correspondence in this period that he was acutely sensitive to the idea of premature death, poignantly aware of it. So Gimbreed dies at 51. Gimbreed's successor at West Point, that's where he had gone to teach, was a close friend of Morse's for about 2 decades. So it's not really a stretch to imagine Morse and his friend at West Point, where Gimbreed taught, to have been in conversation. And Gimbreed had been a very popular teacher at West Point. So in conclusion, William Dunlap, Morse's vice president at the Academy by 1832, had nothing kind to say about Gimbreed when Gimbreed died. He wrote, William Dunlap, who was the first historian of American art, wrote of Gimbreed, this is so mean, "It must have required uncommon talents to teach that which he did not know." So Dunlap could be pretty harsh, and that was in print. Dunlap could be harsh about artists whom he felt had done little to advance the cause of American art, or worse, whom he feared might have even done harm in the way that an inferior instructor might. Morse, the Academy's president, and in his own mind certainly the nation's chief educator in matters of art, was under the circumstances of Gimbreed's death kinder, even grateful. And so I would say that in Gallery of the Louvre, jewel of the city where Gimbreed had trained as an artist, and amidst what Morse called the most splendid collection of works of art in the world, Morse tucked a memento that paid quiet tribute to the miniaturist who had nudged him into his career. Thank you. I'm sorry I talked a little bit too long. I told Brian if I ad-lib, it's all over. So thank you for bearing with me. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'd love to take questions, but it was. I mean, it's always right. Doing history is a detective story, right? I mean, it was just incredibly fun, and the pieces fell into place remarkably fast. It was seriously fun. I think everybody's probably got dinner reservations and they're running off. Yes.
His proportions seem to be very good, like in himself, the size of his hand and the size of his feet. So the woman who's doing the miniature, look how tiny her feet are. Yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't really make too much of that. So the question was the comment was that the proportions seem off if we look at the figures here, and that you look at the woman miniaturist, her feet look really tiny. It's just delicate and ladylike. We're just seeing her little slippers and her white stockings pointed out. But I wouldn't make too much of that, probably. But
More women as being feminist and tiny and small and delicate.
Yeah, you're probably absolutely right. So the point was that maybe it's more goes with the idea of women as being tiny and delicate, and yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we can see that in the figure in the center. Oh yes.
What do you make of the fact that the statue of Diana, Huntress, is there in company with the other women artists?
So the question is, what do I make of the fact that the statue of Diana the Huntress is there in company of the other women artists? Well, that's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. I mean, people actually have thought about what about the two statues in here, or sculptures? There's an urn there. And so one of the essays in that catalog, the 2014 catalog, was about the sculptures in the Louvre, and it's by a really great Americanist art historian, Wendy Bellion. But I was thinking, well, she writes about the statue, and there's this thing right behind. But she wasn't writing about the miniatures. I just can't believe nobody focused. So that was not her subject, and it's a really fantastic essay. So even the existence of the statues has been something that people have commented on, and she made some good things of it. But as far as a sculpture of a woman, a goddess, in space with the women, is that what you're thinking? Why does that? Mm-hmm. Yeah?
These are women who are, acquiring their, perhaps, hunting their skill. I don't know. It's just a thought.
Right, so the idea of hunting, whether there's a kind of metaphorical meaning here that these women, I don't know. I'd have to think about that more, but it's an interesting thought that didn't occur to me. But this would certainly be historical sculpture, right? Because it's a mythological subject, and this was a super famous work. But really, I think that's there so we notice. Haha. So we notice the miniatures. To me, she calls attention to them as much as anything else. But it could be either way. It can be both.
President of the Academy of Design, did he invite many women?
Yes. So the question is whether the president of the National Academy of Design, who would be Morse, whether he was welcoming and receptive to women artists. And that is a great question. I mean, and that's something, probably somebody in that catalog or somebody has written about that, because it is unusual to see. So what did he foresee a place for women artists in this history? This is the very time when the first history of American art. And actually, there probably is an answer to that, but I'm not sure I have it. I mean, the fact that he has these women artists here, and the fact that I think we could see the miniatures as a kind of surrogate self-portrait, but that would be a surrogate self-portrait of Morse when he was very early in his career, before he became the president of the National Academy. There weren't a lot of women artists, in this country. I mean, there were women artists, obviously, out there, but of course, famously, women artists did not tend to find this same kind of support and access to the kind of training they needed, right? So I wish I actually could authoritatively answer that question, because I think one could do it.
I was just wondering why these women artists in Cal.
Yeah, no, it's extremely striking about this work. I think with the Coopers in the corner there, I mean, he and James Fenimore Cooper were really good friends. The Coopers were in Paris. He palled around with James Cooper. Susan Cooper was, painting, so it's kind of a tribute to his friend. The woman he instructs in the middle, and I'm not sure that figure has been identified. I mean, there have been writings just about the figures in the painting, and in fact, the first one of those was 30 some years ago, I think. But yeah, I mean, it's really striking in this picture.
Thank you, Dr. Susan Rather. One final announcement. Dr. Rather's book, The American School, Artists and Status in the Late Colonial and Early National Era, is available in our bookstore, as well as the fantastic exhibition catalog for America, of which Dr. Rather contributed. Thank you all again.